Hello, Team Synergy. I am here to read chapters 46 through 49 of Crispin, The Cross of Lead. Don't mind the mess back there. That's just schoolwork waiting to get done. Happy last week of school, by the way. All right, chapter 46. Hurriedly, I pulled back into the narrow passageway, but peeked out, watching as the soldiers paused. The one-eyed man pointed to the sign of the boot that hung from the building into which Bear and John Ball had gone. The moment the building was singled out, I had no doubt as to what John Aycliffe was intending. Wasting no time, I plunged down the narrow passageway between the buildings, clambered up the wall, and slipped down into the garden a second time. This time, however, I didn't pause at the rear door, but yanked it open. I looked in upon a small room filled with benches, upon which sat some 7 men, Bear among them. Standing before them was John Ball. "Bear!" I shouted. "Soldiers are coming!" At the sound of my voice, he leaped up and spun about to face me. "Where?" "On the street." Even as I spoke, there was a great crash from the front of the house, the door being broken in. "We are betrayed!" John Ball thundered. "Save yourselves!" There was a wild scramble for the rear door as the men, Bear among them, raced to get out. I had to leap aside so as not to be trampled. Once the men were in the garden, Bear took command. Using his great height and strength, he fairly lifted the men onto the back wall, one by one. Once there, they swung their legs over, dropped down, and disappeared. The last to go was John Ball. At the top, the priest hesitated and called, "Bear, don't lose heart. Put your faith in mighty God and me. We'll meet again at the White Stag." Then he, too, vanished. Bear swung about. "Crispin," he said, holding out his arms. I ran to him. He picked me up and all but flung me to the top of the wall. From there, I looked into a narrow alley in which people were passing. One or two who looked up at me with nothing more than idle curiosity. Farther down the way, turning a corner, I could just see John Ball scurrying off. I looked back toward Bear. He had just begun to climb the wall when the soldiers burst out of the house and into the garden. "Go!" Crispin, Bear cried. "Get out of the city! It's you they want, not me!" I dropped into the alley, but instead of running off, I stood in place. Heart pounding, I strained to listening, trying to guess what was happening on the other side of the wall. What I heard were shouts. "Hold him! Secure him!" Then came the sound of blows. Finally, as though from a greater distance, I heard cries, a scream, more shouts, then no more. Frantic, but hardly knowing what to do, go to the aid of Bear or take care of myself, I hesitated. Guilt and fear engulfed me equally. Unable to abide not knowing what had happened, I climbed back upon the wall and looked into the garden. It was empty. I swung over it, dropped back down, ran toward the door, and stepped inside. The room where the meeting had taken place was a shambles, nor was anyone there. Opposite the door by which I had entered was another open door. I ran through it only to find greater disorder. Several low work tables had been overturned. Shoes, slippers, and boots, in various stages of manufacture, lay scattered. I went through another door that led me into the front room of the house. On 2 trestle tables, shoes and boots were displayed, and here a soldier was standing, looking out the broken front door. He turned and saw me. "Halt!" he cried. I spun about and tore back through the rooms I had entered into the garden. Scrambling over the wall, I made my way along the narrow passageway by the side of the house. Once I reached the street, I hastily looked up and down, saw that it was clear, and ran. Whether or not the soldier came after me, I never knew. All I knew was that Bear had been taken by John Aycliffe. It was as I had feared. We'd been trapped. Chapter 47. Desperate to find where Bear was being taken, I raced wildly through the town, more than once taking the chance to stop and speak to strangers. "Did some soldiers holding a large, red-bearded man go by?" I asked. Twice I was told that such a one had just been dragged along. What's more, they were able to point in the direction the soldiers took. I rushed on. Then, as before, I unexpectedly burst into the great square. Though very crowded, I could see a group of soldiers crossing the far side. People were hastily making way for them. Scrambling forward, I wove and dodged through the crowd, tables and stalls, just in time to see the soldiers, with Aycliffe, drag Bear through the open doors of a large building. It was the building I'd noticed before, the one that stood directly opposite the great church. As soon as the soldiers entered with Bear, the doors swung shut. Armed guards, helmets and weapons bright, their livery blue and gold, took up positions before them. Standing there, I was engulfed by alternating waves of rage and helplessness. That it should come to this! In agony, I made the sign of the cross over my heart and made a prayer for Bear's safety. Yet I had little hope that it would bring either comfort or release for my one true friend, if only he had listened to my warning. Then, afraid of being noticed, I stood behind a large man and peeked around him while trying to take measure of where Bear had been brought. "What building is that?" I asked. "The Furnival's Palace," the man replied, "and may God give grace to her ladyship." I continued to stare at the building as if I might see through the stone walls and discover what was happening inside. But while that, of course, proved useless, I did see a man appear on the second-level balcony, the one underneath which stone lions' heads protruded. It was John Aycliffe. He stood looking out over the square as if in search of someone. As I gazed at him, I had little doubt it was me he was seeking. I watched him, my heart full of loathing, until he turned and went back inside. He had taken Bear to get at me. Not knowing what to do, I made my way back to the Green Man. Though disconsolate, I kept my eyes alert for soldiers. I saw a few, but did not think they saw me. Fortunately, by then I had come to know the town well enough that I reached the inn in good time, but remembering the one-eyed man, I entered through the rear. The house was very quiet, though I knew I should go and find Widow Daventry and tell her what had happened. I was in too much torment. I felt a need for time alone to compose myself and think what next to do. Quietly then, I crept up to the second-story solar. As I had expected, our room was empty, but just to see Bear's sack and hat in one corner moved me greatly. Exhausted, I lay down upon the pallet, my mind churning through a clutter of images, things, and words. Again and again the main questions returned. What would they do to Bear? What should I do? The truth was, I felt paralyzed. In a spate of loneliness, I felt about inside Bear's sack, found his recorder, and played a melody. It was the first one he had taught me, but to hear it brought such sadness I put it away. Silence was the only voice that could speak to me. But as I lay there, I don't know for how long, I became aware of a commotion. At first appeared to come from the street. Before I could determine what it was, I heard a crash that shook the entire house. I sat up, listening intently. Now the tumult, shouts and cries came from within the building itself. I heard a scream followed by sounds of crashing, wood splintering, and I knew not what other violence. Leaping up, I didn't know what to do until I remembered the hiding place that Bear had told me about. It took but moments for me to slip the wall board out as he had instructed. Then I crept inside the opening, taking Bear's sack and hat with me. As soon as I pulled the board back, darkness closed about me. I dared not move. It wasn't long before I heard heavy footfalls burst into the room right beyond my hiding place. "He's not here either," I heard a voice say, followed by the sounds of breakage, and finally footsteps receding. I pressed my ear against the wall. When I was certain no one was there, I eased my way out. The room had been completely tossed and turned. The little table had been crushed. Straw from the pallet lay strewn about. With extreme caution, I went out into the hall. It was deserted. At the top of the steps, I listened anew. From below came the sound of weeping. Chapter 48. I made my way down the steps. When I came into the tavern room, I received a further shock. The tables had been smashed, benches were split, the serving counter was overturned, the tankards in which the ale and wine were served lay tumbled about. Many were broken. Midst the room sat Widow Daventry. She was slumped and weeping. Her linen cap lay on the floor. Her hair undone hung down over her broad back. Her smock was torn. Afraid to make my presence known, I stood motionless on the threshold of the room, trying to grasp what had happened. I must have made a sound, for the woman started and shifted her book around. She saw me and quickly turned away. But it was enough for me to see the bruises on her face, her red-rimmed eyes, her hollow mouth from which trickled a spike of blood. She gulped for air, and her crying ceased. When I went and stood by her side, she lifted her head, looked at me, and raised a hand. Once, twice, as if to pump up words. None came. It was as if she had been emptied of all life. Good widow, I stammered. What happened here? Soldiers, she lisped faintly, from the palace. They're searching for you. Will they return? Perhaps, she said wearily. Though I quickly decided not to tell her I had been in the house, I hardly knew what to say. If they find me, I asked, hoping she would give me a different answer. What will they do? Kill you, she said. Groaning with the effort, she came to her feet and surveyed the wreckage with a dazed look. When she spied her cap upon the floor, she picked it up and poked her fingers through its rents. Do you know why? I said. Disgusted, she tossed the cap away. Best ask Bear. Bear's been taken, I said. She swung around. By whom? The soldiers. When? Diminished as she already was, my news reduced her even more. Clumsily, she righted a bench and sat down heavily. Her own weight seemed too much for her. Tell me what happened. I told her all. She listened intently, muttering sacred prayers along with profanities below her breath. When I'd done, she said, May Jesus protect him, and made the sign of the cross. Then her shaking fingers sought her rosary beads. I said, what will happen to him? A loving God will grant a speedy death, she said, squeezing her hands together. Tears began to run down her sunken cheeks again. With a hasty, agitated gesture, she wiped them away. I stood there awkwardly, hardly able to breathe. I said, I heard John Ball cry out that he was betrayed. The woman spat upon the floor. Beware all men who confuse their righteousness with the will of God. They probably don't even know that Ball was here. It's you they want, I warned Bear. She went back to gazing above the wreckage as if still unable to believe what she saw. Widow, I said, what should I do? At first she didn't answer, then she said, you can't stay here. It's too dangerous for you and me. They'll try to get Bear to say where you are, but even if they make him reveal where you are, since they already searched this place and didn't find you, they may not believe him. In any case, Bear will try not to say anything to harm you. He cares too much for you. Then she added, but even the strongest can be broken by torture. Torture? I cried. Tonight, after curfew, she went on, you must escape from the town. In the meanwhile, don't even come into this room. Stay upstairs. Did Bear show you where to hide? I nodded. Go on then. That's where you need to be. I climbed the steps and returned to the room. After slipping inside the tiny hiding space, I closed myself in, welcoming the darkness as the only safe companion to my despair. So much bad had happened, and all because of me. So sad. Chapter 49. I don't know how much time passed before I heard a tapping on the board that kept me hidden. Open up, came Widow Daventry's whisper. I pushed the board out. In her hands was a bowl of soup and bread. Grateful, I took the food and began to eat, though I was almost ashamed to be so hungry. What have you been doing? She asked after setting about the small candle she'd brought. Thinking about Bear. Ah, she said with a sigh. Well, you might. Crispin, forgive me being so angry with you. God knows it's not your fault. She lapsed into silence for a while. Did Bear ever tell you about me? She asked abruptly. No, I said. 2 husbands, 7 children, none alive, and yet I live. She reached out and rested a heavy hand on me. Crispin, she whispered, does God have reasons? I don't know. Head bowed, she began to weep again. I took her rough hand and squeezed it. It was some time before she could compose herself. Cautiously, I said, Good widow, can you read? She looked at me with vacant eyes. A little. Why do you ask? Can you tell me what it says? Here. I held out my cross. She took it and turned it over in her hands. It's from the great sickness, she said. I don't have to read it. Bear told me what it says. He did? She nodded. It says Crispin, son of Furnival. I stared at her. You're Lord Furnival's son. How can that be? Who did you think your father was? My mother only said my father died before I was born in the great sickness. She shook her head. Crispin, for these lords to have sons out of wedlock is common. And Bear knew about me? I managed to say. Yes. And he told you? She nodded. He guessed it from this cross and because of what happened to you. She offered the cross back to me. I took it. What else did Bear say? She sighed. He supposed that your mother was attached to Lord Furnival's court, that she must have been some young, gentle lady who knew how to write and read. Bear imagined her some beauty, enough to catch the eye of Lord Furnival. Furnival must have brought her, no doubt against her will, to your village. But when she quickened with child, he abandoned her, leaving orders that she be held in that place, not killed, but never allowed to leave. Because of me? Yes. Why didn't Bear tell me? He wanted to protect you. From what? Crispin, she said, whatever noble blood there is in you is only poison. Lady Furnival, who's the power here, will never let you have the name. She'll look on you as her enemy, knowing that anyone who chooses to oppose her will use you and what you are. Does she even know of me? I said, amazed. When the woman said nothing, I repeated the question. If she knows as much as I, she may, said the widow. What do you mean? I cried. Crispin, I cannot be certain, but if the rumor of the time, 13 years ago, was true, I believe I know who your mother was. She was the youngest daughter of Lord Douglas. Lord Furnival became infatuated with her. It was the talk of the town. Then word was given out that this young woman died. Apparently not. What difference does that make? I asked bitterly. She's dead now. But if Lord Douglas knew his daughter had a son by Lord Furnival, he might make a claim to the Furnival wealth through you. And if Lady Furnival knew of you as well, she would do anything to protect her power here. Your connection gives no honor, no position. What someone fears is not you, but that you will be used. Can't you see it? Your noble blood is the warrant for your death. It will remain so till it flows no more. I stared at her. Did Bear know this about my mother? I did not tell him. Why? He thought of you as his son. Why put a greater distance between you? Crispin, if it's any comfort, you're probably not the only possible claimant. Considering Furnival's reputation, you're probably only one of many. The House of Furnival will want you all dead. But I make no claim. Those who know of your existence fear you will, which is why you must get away as fast as possible and never, ever return to these parts. She reached out and touched me softly on the face with her rough hands. May sweet Jesus protect you, she said, before she took her leave. So we find out that Crispin is actually Lord Furnival's son, and that's why John Aycliffe wants him dead, because someone might use Crispin to claim the wealth of the Furnivals. Should be interesting what happens next. Not much left. Stay tuned.